When my buddy Greg first suggested a couple's retreat, I thought he was crazy. "It's supposed to help relationships, dude," he said, grinning like a used car salesman. I wasn't convinced. Sure, Hannah and I had our issues, but who didn't? We weren't bad, we just didn't match. Still, the idea of spending the weekend visiting, even if only with trivial team-building exercises, sounded better than spending another Friday night scrolling silently on each other's couches. So, I signed us up. The location was in the Catskills, the kind of place you expect to see on a postcard. Log cabins, crackling fireplaces, and a lake so still it doesn't seem real. 3 other couples were also there. Mark and Jen, high school seniors in love who couldn't stop finishing each other's sentences. Eric and Lila, newlyweds who were still in the obnoxiously happy stage. Then there's Greg and his wife Lisa, the instigators of it all. Hannah was silent as we drove, staring out the window as if deep in thought. I asked if she was okay, but she just nodded, giving me one of those strange smiles that didn't reach her eyes. I chalked it up to nerves. Truth be told, I was nervous too. I've never been good at sharing feelings, and I had a sneaking suspicion that this survival game was going to involve a lot of that. The first night went innocuously enough. We all gathered in the main lodge, where the retreat leader, a cheerful woman named Diane, explained the rules of the game. It was simple. Over the course of the weekend, we would participate in a series of exercises designed to test our confidence and communication skills. What's the catch? Each exercise ended with a truth circle, where each couple had to share something they'd never told each other before. I glanced at Hannah, but she was looking at Diane like she was hypnotized. I wondered what secrets she was thinking about or hiding. Then I felt guilty for thinking that at all. After all, I had skeletons of my own. Nothing major, just little things I had carelessly kept quiet about over the years. The first round of truth was simple. We started small, with silly confessions. I confessed that I broke the garage door last year and blamed it on the wind. Hannah confessed that she hates the pasta I always order at our favorite restaurant. Everyone laughed, and for a moment I thought we were just a couple trying to be better for each other. But the next day things got even harder. The morning began with trust exercises. In one, we were blindfolded while our partner guided us through an obstacle course. Hannah kept hesitating, questioning her instructions, causing me to stumble more than once. "You have to trust me," she said with annoyance when I tripped over another cone. I wanted to reply, "Then stop being so insecure," but bit my tongue. By lunchtime, I noticed that she was spending more and more time chatting with Mark. At first I didn't think much of it. They'd always gotten along. But something had changed in the way she laughed at his jokes, too loud, too long. I told myself I was imagining things. That evening's truth circle was a low blow to me. Diane encouraged us to dig deeper, to share something truly vulnerable. One by one, couples opened up. Mark admitted that he'd thought about changing careers without telling Jen. Lila confessed that early in their relationship, she'd been going through Eric's phone. When it came to us, I was ready to admit that I'd forgotten our anniversary, but covered it up with an expensive dinner. Then Hannah spoke up. "I've been unfaithful." Those words came crashing down on me like a freight train. I felt my heart stop and then beat so fast I thought it might explode. For a moment, I was sure I had misheard. There was silence in the room. Even Diane looked stunned, her professional mask slipping a little. I stared at Hannah, expecting her to say it was a joke, some cruel part of the game. But she just sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap and staring at the floor as if she'd just confessed to stealing a candy bar, not to ruining our marriage. What do you mean?" I finally managed to mumble. She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked up, her eyes were full of tears, but there was something else in them too, confidence. I mean exactly what I said. I cheated. I wanted to scream, to demand an answer, but my throat felt like it was stuffed with absorbent cotton. The other couples were looking anywhere but at us, as if they were afraid to witness the denouement. And then she dropped a real bombshell. "My lover is here at this table." If the room had been silent before, it was dead silent now. I looked around, trying to figure out who it could be. Mark didn't meet my gaze. Eric was shifting awkwardly in his seat. Even Greg looked overly interested in the grain of the table. My hands clenched into fists as I tried to keep myself from exploding. Every muscle in my body was screaming for me to stand up, to scream, to do something. But I just sat frozen in place, running her words over and over in my head. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal, the fact that she'd done this to me in front of everyone, or the horrifying realization that I might have shared drinks, jokes, and trust with the man she was sleeping with. And so the real game began. The cottage looked like it came off a Christmas card. A-shaped cabins nestled under tall pine trees, a porch overlooking the lake, and crisp mountain air that made it seem like all problems were miles away. Except mine weren't. Ever since we arrived, I'd been uneasy, and I had no way of knowing why. Maybe it was the fact that Hannah hadn't said a word during the trip, or the fact that she was avoiding looking me in the eye more than usual. I told myself it was just nerves about the retreat. She wasn't the type to rampantly express emotions or find herself in a group setting like this. But still, something wasn't right. We were the last to check in, and by the time we got to the main lodge, the other couples were already chatting amongst themselves. Diane, the retreat leader, greeted us with an enthusiasm that seemed overly rehearsed. "Welcome, welcome," she said, squeezing our hands as if we were long-lost friends. Her voice was warm, but her eyes stared so intently, as if someone was sizing you up. I looked around the room. Greg and Lisa were sitting by the fireplace laughing about something. Jen was sipping wine with her hand resting carelessly on Mark's shoulder. Eric and Lila were sitting on the couch as if they were posing for a Hallmark magazine postcard. Everyone looked so normal. But then my eyes caught something. Mark. Hannah had been quiet since we'd walked in, but when I glanced in her direction, I noticed that her gaze lingered on him a little too long. It wasn't obvious, nothing that she could be judged for, but it was there. A flicker of recognition. For a split second, she seemed, to me, nervous. I brushed it off. Mark and I had been friends since college, so there was nothing strange about her knowing him. But something about that look made me wary. Maybe it was the fact that he avoided looking in her direction, or maybe it was the fact that his laughter sounded too forced when someone made a joke. That night we all gathered for dinner. The long table in the dining room was set with candles and enough food for a small army. The place should have been cozy, but it felt strange. Everyone was polite, but there was a sense of tension, as if we were all looking out for each other. Hannah sat across from Mark. I don't know if she'd chosen that seat on purpose or if it was just an accident, but every time I looked up, I caught her glance in his direction. She wasn't looking, of course, but it was enough to make my teeth grit. I tried to focus on the conversation. Greg was telling some story about a bad fishing trip, accompanying it with exaggerated hand gestures and sound effects. Lisa was practically crying with laughter, and even Diana smiled. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was a whole other conversation going on in the pauses between words. When dinner was over, Diane called us into the living room for the first session of the survival game. She handed each couple a small notebook and pen, explaining that we were to write down one fear or insecurity in our relationship. We would then share it with our partner in private. Honesty is the first step to growth, she said, her smile so genuine it made me want to roll my eyes. Hannah and I found a quiet corner. I wrote quickly, wanting to get this over with. Sometimes I feel like I'm not enough for you. It wasn't easy to admit it, but it was the truth. When I held out the notebook to her, she hesitated before taking it. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed hers to me. I lowered my gaze to her words. I feel like we've drifted apart. This struck me harder than I had expected. Of course, I had already felt the distance, but seeing it like this made me realize it was real. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she avoided my gaze, staring at the floor as if the answer was written on the wooden surface. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. Hannah had gone to bed early, curled up on her side with her back turned to me. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the past day in my head. The looks, the hesitation, the words she'd written, all added up to a picture I didn't want to look at. And then there was Mark. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something was going on. I had no proof, just a gut feeling, but it was enough to keep me awake. By the time the sun came up, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but I wasn't going to ignore my instincts either. If there was something to look for, I would find it. The next morning began with a trust exercise, which seemed like a wicked joke considering how I was feeling. Diana had us blindfold each other and lead our partners through a makeshift obstacle course. It was supposed to build trust, but all it did was emphasize how distant Hannah and I were from each other. She hesitated at every step, questioning her instructions until I stumbled out of my chair. "You have to trust me," she said, disappointment in her voice. "Trust me." Right. The others didn't seem to have any problems. Mark and Jen went the distance like they'd been doing it for years. Eric and Lila just giggled and cheered each other on. Even Greg and Lisa, who usually bickered like an old married couple, got through it without a problem. But us? We were a mess. By lunchtime, my patience was wearing thin. Every little thing Hannah did or didn't do got on my nerves. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she laughed too hard at Mark's jokes, the way she seemed more preoccupied with the group than with me. I realized I was analyzing too much, but I couldn't stop. My brain seemed to loop, replaying every interaction, every look, every word. Then, during the group discussion, Diane asked us to share what we admire about our partner. It was meant to be a light-hearted exercise, a way to remind us why we fell in love. When it was Hannah's turn, she hesitated. "I admire how you're dedicated to your work," she finally said in an even voice. It felt like a slap in the face. Of all the things she could have said, she chose that one? Not my sense of humor, not my loyalty, not the fact that I'd spent years giving her the life she wanted, just my job? I forced myself to smile, but everything inside me was boiling. When it was my turn, I hesitated, contemplating whether to throw her something equally cold in response. But then I looked at her, sitting there with the same strained smile she'd worn all weekend, and I couldn't do it. "I admire how strong you are," I said, my voice flat. "Even when it's hard, you don't give up." She blinked in surprise, but didn't say anything. There was silence in the room for a moment, the air heavy with unspoken words. The tension between us grew stronger every day. I could feel it in every look, in every pause, in every forced smile. And I knew. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. It was actually happening. The first night of the retreat started as awkwardly as I expected. Diane, the ever-smiling game show host, had us all gather in the lodge's living room, a cozy setting with big armchairs, a crackling fireplace, and those rustic motifs you see in a home decor magazine. There should have been a sense of hospitality here, but forced politeness and thinly veiled discomfort were in the air. The game began with get to know yourself, questions that were as original as a bad first date. Favorite food, childhood nicknames, worst vacation. These were all meant to melt the ice, but barely scratched the surface. I could see, though, that the others were warm to it. Even Hannah relaxed, her laughter a little more genuine than it had been all day. But then Diana pulled out a notepad and pen. "Okay, everyone," she said in the tone that people use when they say they're about to drop something heavy but pretend it's no big deal. "For the next round, I want you to share something your partner doesn't know about you. It doesn't have to be something earth-shattering, just something honest." Honest. Right. The room stirred. You could feel it. The casual laughter and jokes were replaced by nervous glances and strained smiles. No one wanted to speak first, but Diane, as always, encouraged Greg and Lisa. Greg scratched the back of his head, looking sheepish. "Okay," he said, looking at Lisa with a smirk. "I still have the box of baseball cards you told me to throw away 2 years ago." Laughter erupted in the room, and the tension eased for a moment. Even Lisa rolled her eyes, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe she was married to this guy. Lila spoke next, admitting that she'd once eaten half of Eric's birthday cake while he was at work and replaced it with store-bought frosting. There was laughter again. It was light, harmless stuff, the kind of confessions that made you feel like everyone has something small and silly to hide. Then it was our turn. Hannah spoke first, smiling nervously and rubbing the edge of her sleeve. "Yeah, kind of hate our cat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That elicited a chuckle. Even I chuckled, though it was news to me. She adored the fluffy little thing. Or so I thought. "Your turn," Diana said, looking at me expectantly. I hesitated, glancing at Hannah. I didn't have much to share, but even nonsense seemed too revealing under the circumstances. Finally, I settled on something safe. I sometimes leave dishes in the sink overnight, though I tell you I don't, I said with a shrug. The group laughed, and for a second I thought I was off the hook. But Diana wasn't done yet. Great start, everyone, she said, her eyes practically sparkling. Now let's go deeper. Think of a secret that you might be uncomfortable sharing, but that can help build trust when it comes out in the open. And there it was, a twist. I should have seen it coming. Retreats like this always push you into the deep end when you're not ready. My stomach clenched. Greg and Lisa got back on track, their confessions a little more personal, but still within the realm of forgivable quirks. Mark admitted that he was thinking of quitting his job without telling Jen, which elicited an awkward laugh and an even more awkward, "we'll talk about it later," look on her part. Then it was Hannah's turn again. This time she hesitated, interlocking her fingers tightly in her lap. I could see her jaw tense, as if she was contemplating whether to say what she was really thinking. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Sometimes, I feel like we're not as connected to each other as we used to be," she said, her voice soft but steady. Those words struck me like a rash blow, not because they were harsh or unexpected, but because they were true. I could feel it too, the distance between us, the way our conversations had become more about logistics than anything meaningful. "Thank you for sharing with me," Diana said, her tone almost clinical. "And now it's your turn." I nodded, swallowing hard. I could have said something light, like that I hated her favorite show, or that I sometimes missed her work parties because I couldn't stand the small talk. But after what she just said, I felt like I owed her something more. "I feel like I let you down sometimes," I said quieter than I intended. "Maybe I've been too focused on work or other things and haven't been as present as I should have been." Hannah didn't say anything, but I could tell from the look in her eyes that she felt it too. The rest of the night passed in half-joking conversations and polite goodbyes. By the time we got back to our cabin, I was emotionally drained. Hannah went straight to bed, curled up and not saying a word. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and going over the events of the night in my head. The looks, the confessions, the silence. And then Mark showed up. He hadn't shared much during the game. Nothing much, anyway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unspoken between him and Hannah. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was more than that. Either way, I couldn't ignore it. When I woke up the next morning, I found that Hannah had already left. She'd left a note on the nightstand, "Gone for a walk. Be back soon." I threw on some clothes and headed to the main lodge, hoping to grab a cup of coffee and clear my head. But when I walked in, I saw her. She was sitting by the window with Mark. They weren't touching or even sitting too close, but the way they tilted their heads toward each other sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I froze, watching their conversation from the doorway. Whatever it was, it seemed tense. The expression on her face was serious. Her eyes were fixed on his in a way that seemed too intimate. My first impulse was to rush over to him and demand he tell me what the hell was going on. But I restrained myself, telling myself to wait, to gather more information before jumping to conclusions. Instead, I turned around and walked back outside, my head spinning. The cracks were already starting to appear, and I could feel that they were about to get even bigger. The second day of the retreat started like an echo of the first, but with a heavier note that I couldn't quite grasp. Maybe it was the fact that Hannah hardly spoke at breakfast. Her answers were curt and polite. Or maybe it was the fact that she avoided sitting next to me, preferring to join Jen and Mark at their end of the table. I told myself it didn't mean anything. After all, the whole point of this retreat was to reconnect, to bridge the distance we both admitted we felt. And frankly, I was proud of how honest we'd been so far. Hannah's admission that she felt cut off from the world hurt, but at the same time it was a starting point, something we could build on. And yet, as we gathered for the first exercise of the day, I couldn't help but notice how often her gaze settled on Mark. It wasn't obvious. No one else would have noticed, but I'd known her long enough to notice a pattern. The quick glances, the way she moved in her chair when he laughed. It wasn't noticeable, but it was there. The morning session consisted of another round of trust exercises. Diane paired us up with our partners for a series of tasks designed to foster communication. Hannah and I were tasked with completing a blindfolded maze. She verbally guided me through a series of obstacles, relying only on her directions. "Just trust me," she said as I tied the blindfold around my head. I wanted to. God, how I wanted this. She started confidently, her voice steady as she guided me around the chairs and cones. But halfway through, she faltered. Her words became hesitant, and her directions became confusing. "Wait, no, go left." "No, I meant right." I tripped over a cone and barely caught myself before I fell. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice strained. "It's okay," I mumbled, waving her off. But it wasn't okay. By the end of the maze, my frustration was boiling to the surface. I couldn't figure out if it was because of the exercise itself, or because she seemed so distracted, her attention directed somewhere else, even when she was supposed to be leading me. When we were done, I looked over at Mark and Jen. They had effortlessly completed the exercise, laughing and cheering each other on as if they had just won a game show. Hannah was watching them too, and the corner of her mouth twitched into a smile. It was just a smile. It didn't mean anything, didn't it? The afternoon session was even more intense. Diane led us through a series of vulnerable conversations, each couple sitting knee to knee, answering questions designed to uncover the essence of our relationship. "What have you been afraid to tell your partner about?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes I worry that I'm not enough for you, that I've failed you in ways I don't even realize." Hannah's eyes softened, and for a moment I thought we were finally on the same page. "You haven't let me down," she said quietly. "I know things haven't been easy with me lately, but it's not about you. It's about me." Classic. The old "it's not you, it's me" line. But she seemed sincere, and I wanted to believe her. When it was her turn, she hesitated. "I was holding on to something," she admitted. "Feelings I couldn't handle. Resentments I didn't realize I had." It wasn't much, but it was more than I expected. By the time we finished the day, I was feeling cautiously optimistic. We hadn't fixed ourselves, not at all, but we had talked. We had tried. And that was more than I could say about the last few months. But then, as we gathered in the living room for some free time before dinner, I saw it again. The looks. The barely noticeable change. Hannah and Mark stood off to the side, talking quietly while the rest of us chatted amongst ourselves. Their conversation seemed quite normal, but there was something about the way they stood. Close but not too close, their heads tilted toward each other as if they were sharing a secret. I felt a knot in my stomach. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself I was overreacting. After all, Mark and I had been friends for years. He'd been to our wedding, for heaven's sake. There was no way he was crossing that line. But why did I feel like something was slipping through my fingers? That night, as we gathered for dinner, I kept picking up scraps of their conversation, little moments that I remembered for a long time. The shared laughter, the lingering stares. I felt like an outside observer in my own marriage. After dinner, Diane announced the evening's event, a group discussion in which each of us would share what we had learned about ourselves so far. I responded simply by saying that I had realized how much I had taken our relationship for granted. It was the unadulterated truth, but it barely gave an idea of how I really felt. When it was Hannah's turn, she looked thoughtful. "I realized that sometimes you don't realize how badly you need something until it's right in front of you," she said. Her words hung in the air, filled with meaning. I wanted to believe she was talking about us, about the progress we'd made in the past 2 days. But when I caught her eyes on Mark again, my hope faded even further. That night, as we lay in bed, I stared up at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Hannah slept beside me, her breathing even and calm. I wanted to reach out to her, pull her to me and tell her everything I was feeling. But the distance between us seemed insurmountable, like an invisible wall I couldn't break through. And then Mark showed up. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something was going on. I had no proof, just a gut feeling, a nagging suspicion I couldn't shake. But intuition has a way of turning out to be right. As I fell asleep, I made a decision. I couldn't ignore it any longer. If there's something to be found here, I'll find it. And if I was wrong, well, I hoped I was wrong. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I don't know if you've ever had your feet ripped out from under you. Not literally, but in such a way that reality tilted on its axis, and you were suddenly no longer sure that everything around you was solid. That's exactly how I felt at that moment, sitting in a circle of candles in the lodge's living room and hearing Hannah's words. I have been unfaithful. My first thought was that I'd misheard. The fire crackled, someone shifted in their chair, and I wondered if my ears had played a cruel trick on me. But then I looked at her. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she were holding herself together by an effort of will. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a misunderstanding. She'd said it. For a second, I found it hard to breathe. My chest felt tight, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might pierce my ribs. The air in the room seemed to disappear, leaving only a terrible, crushing silence. No one else spoke. Diane, always the energetic host, looked as if she'd been slapped in the face. The other couples avoided eye contact, their discomfort so intense it was almost palpable. I tried to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was spinning, each thought colliding with the other in a chaotic spiral. When? How? Why? Who? Who? That's when I noticed Mark. He was sitting directly across from us, his posture rigid and his gaze fixed on the floor. He looked uncomfortable. Too uncomfortable. My stomach rumbled. I looked back at Hannah, searching her face for a response. She still wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was staring down, and her expression was a mixture of guilt and something else I couldn't define. Defiance, perhaps, or submission. Finally, I found my voice. What are you talking about? She didn't answer right away. When she finally raised her head, her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw the woman I had fallen in love with. The woman who laughed at my stupid jokes and danced in the kitchen when no one was looking. But now there was something foreign in her gaze, something distant. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Was that all? Was that all she could say after such a bombshell? The room was still eerily quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on us, pity and curiosity pressing down on me like a physical force. I hated it. I hated all of it. Why are you saying that now? I asked, my voice sounding sharper than I intended. She hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. Because it has to be about honesty, she said finally. Honesty. The word sounded like a slap in the face. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but I could barely control myself. My thoughts were a mess, crashing together like waves in a storm. And then she spoke up. My lover is here, at this table. The room exploded. Jen gasped, bringing her hand to her mouth. Greg muttered something under his breath, squirming awkwardly in his chair. Even Diane looked stunned, her carefully constructed facade of professionalism fraying at the edges. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. All the air had been pumped out of my lungs and I gasped, drowning in a sea of disbelief and rage. Here? I looked around the circle, shifting my gaze from one face to the next, searching for a clue, any sign of guilt or recognition. But everyone looked as shocked as I was. Except for Mark. He still wasn't looking at me. My mind went into full gear, piecing together every interaction, every look, every moment of the past few days. The way Hannah avoided sitting next to me, the quiet conversations she had with Mark, the way they laughed together like they were having some kind of inside joke. It all came crashing down. I turned to her, my voice low and dangerous. Is that him? She didn't answer. Her silence said more than words could. I felt rage boiling up inside me, hot and uncontrollable. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, my whole body shaking with the effort it took not to explode. Mark finally looked up, his face pale. Yeah, he started, but I interrupted him. Don't, I said, my voice cold. The room was tense, unspoken accusations and barely contained anger in the air. I could feel everyone waiting, holding their breath, not knowing what was going to happen next. I wanted to hit him. God, I wanted to hit him so hard it hurt, but I didn't. Instead, I stood up, and the chair scraped loudly on the floor. I need some air, I muttered, not waiting for anyone's reaction before I ran out of the room. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but it did nothing to cool the fire raging inside me. I paced back and forth on the porch, questions swirling in my head that I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? How could she do this to me? And how the hell was I supposed to face her or him after this? The cabin door creaked open behind me, but I didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," came Hannah's voice, soft and hesitant. "I'm sorry." She kept saying that word, like it was supposed to make everything right, like it could erase betrayal and lies. "Why?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why did you do it?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her words were like knives. "I don't know. It just happened." I turned to face her, anger and pain boiling up inside me. "It didn't just happen, Hannah. You made a choice. You chose to betray me." Tears came to her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not anymore. I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the cold. The night stretched on, heavy and endless. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know where to go next. I had always hated silence. Not the peaceful kind, the silence of early morning or the stillness of a quiet lake, but the oppressive kind. The kind that feels like a heavy blanket suffocating you, filled with words that should have been said but weren't. That's exactly what the silence in the room was like after Hannah's statement. "My lover is here with us tonight." Those words sounded over and over in my head like a relentless drumbeat. For the first few seconds after she said it, there was chaos in the room, but not the kind of chaos that comes with yelling and accusations, at least not yet. No, the chaos was more quiet. People were fidgeting, glancing at each other, and the weight of their discomfort could be felt. I could feel their pity, their curiosity. How no one wanted to speak first, breaking the unbearable tension. I couldn't look at anyone. My gaze was fixed on Hannah, my wife, the woman I thought I knew. Her face was pale and there were tears in her eyes, but there was something else too, some hard resolve, as if she had made peace with the devastation she had just caused. "Say something," I finally managed, my voice low and strained. She didn't say anything. I wanted to scream, to demand an answer, but I couldn't. The lump in my throat was too great, and my thoughts were rushing in different directions. Who was it? When had this started? How long had I been the fool in the room, not noticing what was happening right under my nose? And then Mark appeared. I looked at him, and he looked like a man on the verge of a breakdown. His hands were balled into fists, his jaw tense, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for an escape route. If I didn't already have suspicions, his reaction would remove them. "Okay, let's take a breath," Diana said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Her usual cheerful tone was gone, replaced by something more measured, almost clinical. "Obviously, we have a lot to go through, and I think we should dash." "No," I interrupted, my voice louder than I intended. "I don't want to take a breath. I want answers." I stood up, my hands shaking and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "Who is it?" I demanded, looking at Hannah. She did not meet my gaze. "Who?" I repeated, my voice cracking. Her silence was like a slap in the face. Then Greg, of all people, spoke up. "Come on, man," he said, his tone a mix of sympathy and discomfort. "Let's not do this here." "Why not?" snapped I, looming over him. "We're all here, aren't we? My wife just announced she's fucking one of you. So why don't we get it straight?" The room became even quieter, if that was even possible. Finally Mark spoke, his voice shaking. "Look, maybe we should." "It's you, isn't it?" I interrupted him, pointing a trembling finger at him. His face went pale. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. "Hannah," I said, turning to her again, "just tell me the truth. Is it him?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, didn't do anything. And that was all the confirmation I needed. I felt the world tilt again, and my knees threatened to buckle. The room felt like it was spinning, the faces of the people around me blurring. I heard Jen gasp, her chair scraping on the floor as she stood up. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking, "tell me it's not true." But he didn't. He just sat there with his head on his hands, and his silence was deafening. And then the screaming began. Jen's voice became harsh and angry, a mixture of betrayal and heartache. Greg tried to play the role of mediator, but his words came out too quickly, too calmly, as if he thought he could calm everyone down. Lila just stared at the floor, her face blank, as if she wanted no part of this mess. And me, I just stood there, the noise around me fading into the background. All I could see was Hannah. All I could think about was every moment we'd shared, every promise we'd made, every time I'd trusted her. Now it all felt like a lie, as if the life we had built together was crumbling before my eyes. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked out of the room, the cold night air hitting me like a punch. I stood on the porch and breathed in short, ragged sighs. The stars were out. The night was so quiet it seemed as if the cabin and its chaos didn't exist. I wanted to run, to keep going until I was far away from this place, from this nightmare. But I couldn't. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Hannah standing there with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let me explain." I shook my head. The words stuck in my throat. "Explain what, Hannah? That you lied to me? That you slept with my best friend?" Tears streamed down her cheeks, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not anymore. "I didn't mean for that to happen," she said, her voice trailing off. "It's just—" "Don't," I said, interrupting her. "Don't say it just happened. It doesn't happen that way. You made a choice, Hannah. You chose to betray me. You chose to destroy everything we had." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the look on Mark's face, the way she couldn't even deny it when I asked her if it was him. And the anger flooded back. "I need space," I said, my voice cold. "Don't follow me." I walked down the steps, my feet crunching on the gravel of the walkway. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I only knew I couldn't stay there, couldn't look at her, couldn't look at the wreckage of my life anymore. The night stretched on, the cold biting my skin, but I hardly felt it. My mind was churning, trying to make sense of everything, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do now. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, utterly lost. Morning came all too quickly, taking the pain of insomnia with it. I spent most of the night wandering the lodge grounds, trying to figure out how my life had fallen apart so quickly. Every step on the gravel paths was an attempt to sort myself out, to catch my breath, to not collapse under the weight of what I now knew. Hannah had been wrong. The details were hazy, but the fact itself was a deeply embedded knife. And Mark? My oldest friend, the man I trusted unconditionally? The betrayal felt like a second blade stabbed into my back. When I finally made it back to the cabin, the sun was already creeping over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gray and orange. Hannah was sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoulders hunched and her fingers nervously rubbing the hem of her sweater. She didn't look up when I walked in. "We need to talk," I said, my voice rough with fatigue and anger. She looked up at me, her eyes swollen with tears. "I already told you everything last night," she said quietly, lowering her eyes again. "No," I replied, more sharply this time. "You dropped the bomb and left. That doesn't mean I told you everything." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "What else do you want me to say?" I stepped closer, the space between us shrinking but still remaining like a chasm. "I want to know why, Hannah. I want to know for how long. I want to know." I stopped, my voice trailing off. "I want to know if this is real." Her shoulders slumped even lower, and for a moment I thought she was actually going to tell me. But instead she shook her head, her expression turning defensive. This whole retreat was about honesty, right? That's what Diana said. So here I was being honest. "Isn't that what you wanted?" Her words came down on me like another blow. But this one wasn't clean. She felt out of place, rejected. I stared at her, searching for some kind of answer in the way she avoided my gaze, the way her hands that clutched the fabric of her sweater trembled slightly. "This isn't about retreat," I said, my voice quieter but no less firm. "This is about you and me, about what you did, about why you couldn't just tell me the truth before it came to this." She finally looked at me, her eyes dark and wary. "You think this is easy for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you think I wanted all of this to happen?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You didn't want this to happen? You chose this to happen, Hannah. You chose to deceive me, to hide it from me, to stand up in front of everyone and humiliate me instead of confessing in private. Her face crinkled, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of vulnerability in it. But just as quickly it disappeared, replaced by the same defiant mask she'd worn the night before. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "Then help me understand," I pleaded, my voice trailing off despite my best efforts to keep it steady. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her words only made the pain in my chest worse. "It's not about you," she said. "It never was." I stared at her, and the weight of her words sank into me like a lead anchor. "How can you say that? You destroyed us, Hannah. You destroyed me. How can this not be about me?" She shook her head again, raising her hands to cover her face. "I don't know how to explain it," she whispered. I couldn't hold it in anymore." Her cryptic answers only fueled my suspicions. Was this her attempt to punish me for some perceived offense? A twisted form of revenge for years of marital complacency? Or was she crying out for help, desperate to free herself from something I hadn't expected? I went over our entire relationship over the past year in my mind. Every fight, every cold shoulder, every strained smile. Were there signs I'd missed? Were there clues I'd ignored? "Why, Mark?" I asked finally, the question cutting through the silence like a blade. She raised her head, her eyes widening. For a moment I thought she might deny it, but then her gaze shifted to the side again and my stomach sank. "It wasn't supposed to be like that," she muttered. Her answer, or lack thereof, was confirmation enough. I stepped back, and the distance between us widened again, this time intentionally. "I trusted you," I said, and the words came harder than I'd expected. "I trusted him." She flinched, but I didn't care. The anger was bubbling up again, hot and uncontrollable, and I no longer had the strength to suppress it. "It wasn't just a mistake, Hannah," I continued. "It was a choice. A whole series of choices. You didn't trip and fall into his bed. You didn't accidentally ruin our marriage." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't say a word. A silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and went to the door, keeping my hand on the knob. "I need space," I said, repeating the words from the night before. "Don't follow me." This time she didn't follow. I stepped outside, the crisp morning air burning my skin. The lodge grounds were quiet. The other couples were still sitting in their cabins, probably trying to make sense of what they had witnessed the night before. I didn't know where to go. My feet carried me aimlessly along the gravel path, and my thoughts were a chaotic tangle of anger, resentment, and confusion. How could this have happened? Hannah's excuses only deepened the cracks in my trust, the foundation of our marriage crumbling beneath my feet. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some reason that would set things right. But deep down, I knew the truth. There wasn't a good enough reason. No explanation that could undo the damage that had been done. And as I walked further into the woods, away from the cabin, away from Hannah, away from the wreckage of my life, one thought kept repeating in my head. Nothing would ever be the same again. I've always considered myself a rational person. Sure, I get angry like everyone else, but I pride myself on being able to step back and think things through before acting. But after the last few days, I wasn't sure I recognized myself anymore. When you find out your wife cheated on you, and then watch your so-called best friend squirm every time you're in the same room, it does something to you. Rationality flies out the window. You start doubting everything, seeing connections where there may not be any, and questioning every memory. Mark was avoiding me. It was obvious. The morning after Hannah's confession, I caught him coming out of the dining room as I entered, mumbling something about needing to make a phone call. When I passed him in the hallway later, he barely nodded, his eyes staring at the floor. And during one of the group exercises, he was comfortably paired with Jen, his wife, instead of joining the general class like everyone else. He wasn't elusive. Meanwhile, Eric, whom I never suspected of anything, kept showing up with unsolicited reassurances. "Dude, I just want to say I'm sorry you had to deal with that," he said, cornering me in the cabin kitchen while I poured coffee. But for what it's worth, I swear I had nothing to do with it. I don't know what Hannah was thinking, but I had no part in it. I stared at him, my jaw clenched. And I wasn't thinking, I said sharply. His face reddened, and he laughed nervously. Yeah, of course you did. Just wanted to clear the air. You know? Crazy weekend. Huh? I didn't answer anything. He slipped out after a minute, muttering something about needing to check on Lila. Everything that was happening felt surreal, like I was trapped in a bad soap opera. Everyone around me seemed to have their own agendas, their own secrets, and I was left to navigate a minefield of intuition and growing paranoia. By noon, I was on the verge of a breakdown. Diane, always the cheerful facilitator, organized another round of trust exercises. This time we were to take turns directing our partners to complete a simple blindfolded task, giving only verbal instructions. I couldn't think of anything less appealing. Hannah and I went last. By then my patience was wearing thin, and her hesitant, stuttering instructions were only getting on my nerves. Left, she said, her voice sounding unsure. I moved to the left, but tripped over a chair leg. I'm sorry, she mumbled. I meant to the right. I held back a curt reply, clenching my fists to contain my frustration. When the exercise was finally over, I ripped the blindfold off my eyes and, without a word, walked away. Mark was standing at the edge of the group, talking quietly to Jen. I caught the end of their conversation as I walked by. Just give me some space, he was saying, his tone strained. Jen looked hurt, but nodded and stepped aside as Mark turned and headed for the door. I followed after him. Mark, I called out, and my voice echoed down the hall. He froze, his shoulders tensing before he turned to face me. Hey, he said, forcing himself to smile weakly. What's up? We need to talk, I said, leaving no room for argument. He looked around, as if searching for an escape route, and then nodded reluctantly. Okay, let's go outside. It was cool outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lodge grounds. Mark and I walked a short distance away from the building and stopped near a clump of trees. I didn't waste any time with pleasantries. Did you sleep with her? I asked, my voice low and steady. He flinched, his eyes widening. What? You heard me, I said, my tone becoming harsher. I was asleep. You slept with Hannah? He turned away, shoving his hands in his pockets. Come on, man, he muttered. You really think I'd do that to you? I don't know what to think, I replied. But you're acting so damn guilty, Mark. You can't even look me in the eye. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Look, I've been dealing with a lot, okay? Work's been a mess and Jen and I dash. Don't, I interrupted him, my voice cold. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just tell me the truth. He hesitated, his jaw clenched. For a moment, I thought he might actually confess. But then he shook his head. I have nothing to tell, he said firmly. Whatever's going on with Hannah, it's not me. I swear. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. His words sounded sincere, but his body language told a different story. Okay, I finally said, my voice heavy with disappointment. But if I find out you're lying. He answered nothing, his gaze fixed on the ground. I walked away, anger, suspicion, and doubt tangled in my thoughts. That night, as we gathered for dinner, the tension in the room was palpable. Jen sat as far away from Mark as possible, her expression cold and detached. Hannah avoided my gaze completely, her shoulders slumped as if she were trying to make herself invisible. Eric, opportunistic as ever, took the opportunity to pull me aside again. Dude, I just want to say. Eric, I interrupted, my patience finally breaking. Stop it. Just stop. His mouth opened and closed a few times before he nodded and pulled away. The rest of dinner passed in tense silence. Lying in bed that night and staring at the ceiling, I felt more lost than ever. Mark's evasiveness, Eric's unsolicited reassurances, Hannah's cryptic excuses, was like the pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. The only thing I knew for sure was that nothing would ever be the same. By the time the last day of the retreat arrived, I was working my ass off. Sleepless nights, endless cycles of suspicion and doubt, mounting tension. It all poured out that morning. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around me, the weight of everything pressing down, and I could barely breathe. Hannah hadn't spoken to me since our last confrontation, and Mark's evasiveness only added to my suspicions. Everywhere I turned, I could feel the stares on me, pitying, curious, judgmental. Other couples whispered behind me, their sympathy cutting me more deeply than outright contempt. I couldn't take it anymore. I noticed Mark standing at the edge of the lodge grounds, his back to me, looking out over the lake. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets and his posture tense. He must have sensed my approach because he turned slightly, his expression wary. "Mark," I said, my voice low and strained. He didn't answer anything, only shifted awkwardly as I shortened the distance between us. "We're not leaving this place until you tell me the truth," I said, stepping into his space. "No more excuses. No more excuses. Just say it." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Look, man," he began, his tone already defensive. "Don't," I cut him off. "Don't start the listen, dude bullshit. Just tell me the truth. Did you sleep with my wife?" His jaw clenched and his eyes flicked away from mine. For a moment I thought he was going to start denying again. But then he exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Yes." Those words hit me like a sledgehammer. My breath caught, my chest constricted as the reality of his confession hit me. "For how long?" I asked, my voice shaking. He hesitated, then muttered, "A few months." "A few months." I felt like I was going to throw up. "Why?" I asked, my voice rising even though I tried to stay calm. "Why the hell did you do this to me?" He flinched at the anger in my tone, and his expression became pained. It wasn't like I planned it," he said. "It just happened." "It just happened?" I repeated, disbelief sounding in my voice. "What the hell does that mean, Mark? You can't just happen to be in bed with someone else's wife." He rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze still avoiding mine. "You don't get it, man," he said. "You've been so withdrawn. Always working, always stressed. She felt like you didn't notice her anymore." His words hit a nerve I hadn't even realized I had. "And that's your excuse?" I shot back, my voice shaking with rage. "Because I overworked myself, you thought it was okay to fuck my wife?" "It wasn't like that," he insisted, his tone defensive. "We were both in a bad place. It just happened, you know?" Something inside me clicked. Before I realized what I was doing, I pushed him. Hard. He staggered backward, his hands coming up in a weak attempt to calm me down. "Hey, kid, calm down," he said, but his words only fueled my anger. "Calm down?" I growled, stepping towards him again. "You slept with my wife, Mark. You betrayed me, and now you want me to calm down?" I pushed him again, harder this time. He stumbled, but this time he didn't remain passive. He pushed back, his hands resting on my chest. "What do you want me to say?" He shouted. "That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? What's in it for me?" The dam broke. I swung, and my fist smashed into his jaw. A shiver ran down my arm from the impact, but I barely felt it through the haze of anger that clouded my mind. He jerked back, his hand flying up to his face. "Are you serious?" he shouted, but I was already swinging again. The next few moments passed in a riot of emotion and adrenaline. I threw a few more punches, my fists colliding with his chest, his shoulder, his ribs. He tried to fight back, but his punches were weak and his movements clumsy. Eventually someone pulled me away from him. Turning around, I saw Greg, his expression a combination of shock and anger. "That's enough, man," he shouted, holding me down as Mark scrambled to his feet, his face bruised and bloody. "Let me go," I growled, but Greg held firm. "Take a walk," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Chill out before you do something you can't take back." I waved him off, turned and walked away without another word. As I walked back to the cabin, my hands shaking and my chest heaving, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in my mind. I had confronted Mark. I got answers to my questions, but I didn't feel any better. More than that, it made me feel worse. Mark's confession ripped out the last drops of denial I was still holding on to. The affair wasn't some misunderstanding or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate betrayal born of the choices they both made. And now I was left to pick up the pieces. The anger was still simmering, but something else had been added to it. An overwhelming sense of loss. I'd lost my wife, my best friend, the life I thought I had built. And as I walked into the empty cabin, the weight of it all finally brought me to my knees. Coming home after the retreat was like visiting a haunted house. Everything in the house was the same, but nothing seemed familiar. The pictures on the walls, the furniture we'd picked out together, even the faint scent of Hannah's perfume wafting through the air, it all felt wrong, like I'd walked into someone else's life. On the way back, Hannah and I hardly spoke at all. I kept my eyes on the road and gripped the steering wheel tightly, while she stared out the window and kept silent, sighing only occasionally. The trip was supposed to fix things, to help us reconnect, but all it did was ruin everything around us. When we finally pulled up to the house, she hesitated before getting out of the car. I didn't wait for her. I walked into the house, dropped my bag by the door, and sat on the couch, staring stupidly at the wall. The silence was unbearable. "I think we should talk," she finally said, her voice soft and unsure. I looked at her. Anger and betrayal simmered deep inside. "About what?" I asked, my tone colder than I had intended. She flinched, but didn't back down. "About what comes next," she said. "Further." The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. What would happen next? Counseling? Separation? Divorce? Is it possible to rebuild trust after something like that? And do I even want it at all? "I don't know," I answered honestly, my voice trembling slightly. Hannah sat down across from me, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "I know I hurt you," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "And I'm really, really sorry. I don't know how to fix it." Her words should have meant something, but they seemed empty. "How long?" I asked, my voice quieter now. She looked confused. "How long were you going to put up with this before you told me?" I clarified. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know." That was the worst part. She didn't know. The next days passed like a blur. We didn't fight, not really. The anger I had felt during the retreat cooled, replaced by an emptiness and numbness that made me feel like a ghost in my own life. I went to work, came home, ate dinner in silence, and went to bed without saying a word to Hannah. A few times she tried to engage in conversation with me, but her attempts seemed forced, as if she was acting out a script she didn't believe in. One evening I found myself scrolling through counseling websites, half-heartedly researching therapists in the area. Part of me wanted to try, to give Hannah a chance to make things right. But the other part of me, the part that felt crushed every time I thought about her and Mark doubted whether it was even worth the effort. Betrayal wasn't just about the act itself. It was about the lies, the deception, the breaking of the trust that had been ingrained in our marriage long before the affair began. Could it be fixed? One afternoon I found myself sitting in my car outside a coffee shop, staring stupidly at the steering wheel. I had planned to grab a coffee and clear my head, but instead I just sat there, immersed in thought. I thought about the day Hannah and I met, about how her laughter drew me in like a magnet. I thought about our wedding, the vows we'd made to each other, the promises we believed we could keep. I thought about the good times and the hard times, the moments that made us feel indestructible. And then I thought about Mark, about how he'd looked me in the eye all these years, pretending to be my friend while he betrayed me behind my back. How Hannah had chosen him over our marriage, even if it was only for a few months. The rage rushed back, hot and unrelenting. But it was quickly followed by a crushing sadness. I didn't know if I could forgive her. When I finally got home, Hannah was waiting for me in the living room. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and swollen with tears. "I made an appointment with a counselor," she said quietly, "for both of us. If you want to go." I nodded, not believing I could speak. The first session was awkward, to say the least. The counselor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a soothing voice, asked us to talk about why we were here. Hannah spoke first, her voice shaking as she confessed her cheating, the way she felt neglected, the hurt she didn't know how to express. I listened with my jaw clenched and my hands gripping the armrests of my chair. When it was my turn, The words came out in a rush. Betrayal. Anger. The sense of inferiority that had crept into my soul over the years. The feeling that no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough. The counselor nodded thoughtfully, her expression neutral but sympathetic. Rebuilding trust is a long process, she said. It requires honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to admit some very painful truths. Painful truths. That was an understatement. After the session, Hannah and I sat in the car and didn't say a word. The silence was heavy, but not as stifling as before. It felt like the beginning of something. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe we'll get through this. Or maybe we won't. But for the first time since the retreat, I feel like I can breathe again. And that's enough for now.